I want to welcome you to our Tuesday night Bible study, and as you guys know, prayer time. Glad you could be with us. We hope you are healthy and well and ready to engage in a little bit of theological stimulus as we begin to walk with Daniel a little bit deeper into visions. Tonight we're going to kind of touch on the third beast, and then we're going to have our prayer time. What I do want to say to you guys is that Friday night, we really want to turn it into a forum of conversation and dialogue. As you guys already know, we're unpacking the Marxist philosophy, the Communist Manifesto, and its relationship to this neo-Marxist cultural revolution that we're in, and how it actually threatens the gospel. It mitigates the gospel's impact if you fall prey to that system. They know it. The Marxists know it, and Karl Marx and Engels knew it himself. This is why we're going after it and helping people to see what's going on in some of the categories that are there. So make sure that you are ready to participate. We'd love to have a good group of you out on Friday night to engage in in-house conversation around these things. Because quite frankly, as I said before, there are going to be three responses that all of us are going to engage in around these matters that are actually not going to allow you and I to do much by way of kind of just sleeping it through. If you've ever heard of Rip Van Winkle, how that he slept through many, many decades of life and then woke up under a tree realizing that he was in another century. We don't have that luxury today. Because of media. Media does not allow us to be ignorant. We won't be able to ultimately claim ignorance because media is so ubiquitous, it's pervasive, it is continuous, and we get information all the time. So we're all operating out of a kind of global consciousness. That being the case, the believer needs to be able to give an answer. And to give an answer in a way that speaks relevantly to where you and I are today. And there are so many categories that we have to be able to detect when we're talking to people about these issues that are pressing down upon us politically, socially, economically, philosophically, then of course culturally and theologically. We want to be much more adept at these as believers than we presently are. There are going to be three modes that we all operate out of. One is we're going to be operating out of an abstain mode. Abstain mode. We're going to be inclined to avoid, and avoiding and abstaining will work for a certain type of person. So let me kind of say it like this. If you understand who you are and you're fairly clear on your place in life, your calling, and you may realize that right about now you are 65 or 70 years old, and we have such an eclectic that follow us at Grace. You're 75 years old. You've been through the civil rights movement. You've been through Jim Crow. You've been through a lot of battles. You really don't have any energy for the present battle. And therefore, you're not as interested in understanding all of these complex issues. You're just basically on the periphery of a kind of retirement mode believer. There's nothing wrong with that. I want to affirm you in the freedom of avoiding and therefore abstaining from the cacophony of this battle. I want to affirm you in the freedom of avoiding and abstaining from the cacophony of this battle. If you're saying, Pastor Jesse, I'm 80 years old, I'm 85 years old, I'm 90 years old, I don't understand what's going on, I don't understand the issues, I am not compelled to want to get involved, you are free not to get involved. You must own your freedom. This is one of the errors of politics. It loves to drag people into agendas and movements and make you feel guilty when you don't get involved. You must own your freedom in Christ, and you must own your freedom as an American. You don't have to. People will ask me now that they're starting to get it again after the third major time in our ministry here at Grace as I teach about politics, the diabolical nature of politics. They will recognize that they don't particularly care for either party and they want to get off the pump cart and not go down that same track. So, Pastor, what do? I've been taught all my life that I am obligated to vote. That's the master telling you you can't get off the plantation. You can get off the plantation. Voting is a right. Voting is not a mandate. You don't have a Bible verse in Scripture that says you must vote. That's master telling you to stay on the plantation, get caught up in the pump cart ride, and now you're obligated to engage in what is called the lesser of two evil compromises. Do you guys understand what I mean? The lesser of two evil compromises. You guys are welcome to come on in. There's an outline right there if you want to grab a couple of outlines. We are in Bible study mode before prayer mode. And I'm bad with looking at people with masks off. So with masks on, okay, come on in, make yourself at home. And plop down somewhere and pop your Bibles out. We're getting ready to, we're actually in the brief of a study right now. So just forgive us for continuing to talk. So what I was stating was for our older members in society who have voted for years and engaged in for years, but have finally said, I don't have any energy, because there will come a time when topics are so complex that they are over the head of our older people. They must not feel compelled to do something that they don't understand. You cannot righteously push older people into the fray of battles against their will. That is not Christian and it's not American. So I say to our older people, you need to actually submit to the reality that you are not conscientiously ready to make a choice. And that's called integrity. The integrity of not voting is the integrity of not going against your conscience. This is freedom for people in America. And so you do have the right to abstain. You have the right to avoid making a decision that will either contribute to an outcome that you don't agree with or make you implicatory to it. This is Amos chapter 5, verse 3. You can read it for yourself. Amos was talking about the difficult times in which the people of God would be in. And Amos 5:3 says, let me see here. Amos 5:13, if you will. Amos 5:13. I remember this years ago. I thought this was so wise. It says, therefore the what? The prudent shall what? Keep silent in that time, for it is a what? Evil time. And if you and I don't know how to parse the evil, parse the troubles, really work through the complexity of those matters, you can bow out in prudence and avoid and abstain from any kind of contribution that will add to stumbling blocks. I just want you people who are feeling compelled not to engage, understand you are not mandated by God to vote. You have the right to, but you're not mandated to. Those who do, however, get into the fray are obligated to be informed. So some of us may be inclined to get in, and I call this those of us who are willing to argue. But even if I argue, I must not argue ignorantly, emotionally, and passionately, apart from being informed and clear on my position. So going back again to a priority about whatever I am called to do. If I'm going to do something, here's what I have to know. I am operating out of a calling. I am clear on my identity. Cultural, circumstantial fray that it does not cause me to shift from or be distracted from my priority. Once again, here's what we want to affirm, and here's the reason for which we are battling against some of the cultural trends. Everyone has inalienable rights. Every one of us are created in the Imago Dei. Every one of us is a child of God. And to whom do we have to ultimately answer? God. No one on the planet gets to tell you and me what we have to do in usurpation of who God is. The moment you let that happen, you are now a slave to anybody's system. And as a child of God, you cannot let that happen. And this is one of the problems with politics, because in politics, whenever you take politics and mix it with religion, Christianity, or whatever, eventually politics, because politics by nature is what we're learning in the book of Daniel, what? A beast. He's predatorial and he is overbearing by nature. That's the nature of politics. It's beastly. So Christianity, if we were to take on a zoomorphism of Christianity, is Christianity an animal? Yes. Is it a beast? No. That is, it is not a predatorial creature. Christianity is a lamb. Christianity is a sheep. And as sheep and as lambs, we are not into dominating, conquering, controlling, taking advantage of people, forcing our way. As lambs, we're called to be peacemakers, and that through sacrifice. So we cannot actually find ourselves collapsing into a political conflict and using the same types of methods they do. That's what we learned in the book of Revelation. So when I talk about if we're going to argue, if you and I got something to say, we have to be apologetic about it. You guys understand that? Apologetic means you have to be knowledgeable about all sides. All sides. That means do your homework. And then you have to be clear on your position. Like, I'm a Christian, and you're never going to get me to diminish my priority of proffering Christianity as the answer to all these problems in order to side with anybody on a horizontal level. So when you see me sitting at the table of debates and forums, as soon as it's my turn to talk, I'm going to say the solution to all of our problems is God and Christ and the Word of God. I'm obligated to do that. I'm not obligated to subordinate the Word of God to any other secular system. That's just me. So my apologetics is going to always be the supremacy of biblical truth as the foundation and framework of interpreting right and wrong in terms of whatever the political or social issues are. I'll prove that here in a moment. But then the third category that believers will take, they can't help but take it, will be the third category of agreement. Now, this is really interesting because agreement can be saved on a social and personal level. If you're very agreeable, people can like you. Problem is, when you got two friends who operate out of two different dialectical positions, and how now are you going to be able to maintain allegiance with their friendship if one has a worldview different than the other person, and now you're trying to be agreeable to both of them, you get split in half. Now you are making yourself a what? Hypocrite. Because as much as you want to agree with your friend on the left, you also want to agree with your friend on the right. And you can't agree with both of them with integrity if their views are diametrically opposed to one another. Does that make any sense? All right. So if I'm that kind of person and you have people who are not strong enough to say, you know what, I love you, but I don't agree with you. You have people who just are not strong enough to do that. And they're more inclined to agree and go home feeling bad because they nodded their head yes. At that point, they have to hear what our Lord said in Matthew 5:37. Let your yes be yes and your no be no, because anything else is evil. Let your communication be yea and yea, or nay and nay. For whatsoever is more than these cometh of what? It means that you don't have the ability to be honest about your view. I don't agree with that. I agree with that. Or I don't understand that. And therefore, please don't force me to take a position when I don't understand it. That's called integrity. So people will operate out of one of these three. I want to share something with you in regards to why I am driving against the normative larger narrative that's going on in our society. I believe that there are some really problematic components with it, and particularly it's because I proffer a biblical view of dealing with social issues. And I think that there's no social issue or spiritual issue or political issue or economic issue, if you will, or even psychological issue in our world that the Bible hasn't already dealt with. Give you an example. So we all would believe, I think, if we're careful to be honest, that there is a problem in our judicial system and there is a problem in our law enforcement system. Would you agree with that? There's a fundamental, obvious, empirical problem that needs to be dealt with. Would we agree that the solution is the solution that is presently being proffered now? Tear down all law enforcement, defund the police, because that's part of the larger narrative being pushed. Right. Now, if you say no, that's fine, but you have to ask yourself, where are you coming from with your Matthew 5:37 position of nay, nay? Right? You really still have to be able to prove that your nay, nay is operating out of some kind of authority base. Now, if you're a Christian, as I am, my authority is the Word of God. So I'm going to show you how I filter people's views and filter solutions. Presently, I actually believe that the solutions that are being handed down by the momentum of the political protests today are solutions that are really contrary to the interest of America and contrary to the ethics of the Bible. For instance, do you know the Bible actually speaks to this issue of how we are to respect and regard and engage law enforcement? Do you know that? Right. So the Bible would, for me, say specifically that the issue of stripping law enforcement, police, of the right to actually be paid to do what they do is unbiblical. The notion of a man or a woman who signs up to actually put themselves in harm's way to protect you and me, that for us to say you got to kind of, pay your way, become like a citizen's cop and don't have the resources to actually take care of you, because now when you become a police officer, you are really dealing with a whole lot of dangerous elements whereby you are worthy of your hire. And let me show you how the Bible actually addresses that. I'm in Luke chapter 3, where John the Baptist has basically preached the gospel, and men and women of all stratums of life have come to understand the need to submit to the lordship of Jesus Christ and its implications in their life. What does that mean? Once you are a saved person, now you want to live responsibly. So there are three classes of people who come to John the Baptist. After recognizing that John's ministry is a ministry from Christ, we read this over in chapter 3, and I'm going to start now at verse 10. And the people asked him, saying, now you notice what it says here, the people. This here is your common folk. This is your everyday people. And the people asked him, saying, what shall we do then? Now that we know Jesus is coming, now that we know we got to bow the knee to him, now that we know he's getting ready to turn things upside down, because he was going to turn Israel upside down, and he did. Now that we are waiting for the Lord, what do we do now? And here's how John deals with the ethical responses to the gospel. He answered and said unto them, he that hath 2 coats, let him impart to him that hath none. Point number 1. You know what John said? Share, didn't he? Share. He says, if you have 2 coats and you recognize that there's a person who doesn't have that coat, volunteer to give that person your coat. Why is he saying that? Is he saying that because somehow that there is kind of a mandate that he has to operate out of, and if he doesn't do that, then somehow society is going to collapse? No. John is saying that now that you are a Christian, your job is to look for every opportunity you possibly can to get close to people in need in order to share the gospel with them. John is saying that as a prophet of his time, he understood what Jesus says, the poor you're going to have always with you. And you're going to be in practical situations where you run across somebody of whom, if you just care about your surroundings, you're going to be better off than they are. John is talking to me, and I know he's talking to you too, because we all got more than one coat in our closet. So here's what John says. If you got 2 coats and you see your brother have one, give him one. And particularly give that brother who doesn't know Christ that coat. Because he's going to say, why are you giving me a coat? Because my master, who saved me by his grace, not only provided a coat for me, he provided 2, and I only really need 1. And when it gets to a point where I need another one, he will give me grace to go out and work and get it, or he will provide for me out of the abundance of his goodness. So what John has just done is taken the gospel and put shoe leather on it in terms of the culture and environment that we live in. What John did not do was to take a socialist paradigm and say, we're going to take one of your coats from you and give it to that other brother. John did not advocate government taking your coat and giving it to somebody else. You understand what I'm getting at there, because this is basically what we are dealing with in our society, where government becomes so intrusive that they begin to set the laws of ethics. We are still operating out of a free framework here, are we not? You're a believer. God has blessed you. You have resources, in fact, more than you need. And John is saying, if you are a believer that understands opportunity for witnessing the gospel, look for a need and meet it. And then when they ask you about that need, tell them, God has been good to me. His grace has been abundant to me. And I don't need more than what God has provided for me. So here, man, take this coat. Here, sister, take this coat. And God bless you. And it may be a door open for the gospel. That's how the early church spread the gospel in the first century. Show you another one. Notice how it goes on to say, and he that hath meat do likewise. Same thing with food. Koinonia is the Greek term for fellowship. And we know throughout all of human history, there has been inequity in terms of people not always having something to eat. Again, the poor you will always have with you. If you discover that you have someone in the neighborhood, friends or family or what have you, who really don't know the Lord, because this is all about evangelism, and you have actually more to eat than you need, seek an opportunity to share that food with them. The church has learned how to do that many times over in the centuries we've been in existence. You share that food with them with the same premise, right? God has been good to me. He has blessed me. I have more than I need. Here, you eat this, and if you need more, holla at me. Why are you doing that? Because of God's goodness in my life, because of Christ's mercy in my life. Before I was saved, I was utterly selfish, and I hoarded, and I just embraced everything to myself. But my soul could never, ever be satisfied with material things. Now that Christ has met my needs, I'm able to now share out of the abundance that he has given to me in order that he might be glorified. We're sharing, but the government is not making me do that. You understand that? That's a big difference. Show you the next one. This is the point that I'm getting at in terms of defunding the police, putting the police in a precarious situation where economically that man or that woman, that police officer cannot take care of their family, and yet they're out there in order to ostensibly take care of me. This one here is remarkable. Watch the interpretation here, how just and accurate the inference is in this verse. This is over in verse 13. He first starts in verse 13, he says, and he said unto them, exact no more than that which is appointed to you. Oh, verse 12. Then came also publicans to be baptized, and he said unto them, Master, what shall we do? And the publicans were what? Tax collectors. Here we go. He says unto them, what? Exact no more than that which is appointed. This is quite phenomenal. You know what? He didn't say get rid of your tax business, because your tax business is part of the system, and the system is corrupt, and we want to do away with it. He didn't say that. And yet the tax system was part of the larger system, and the larger system was corrupt. But the goal of the gospel was not to tear down the system. It was to ensure that on an individual level, men and women who have been confronted with the claims of Christ and had come to know him in the new birth and was affirmed by baptism would now occupy that particular office with integrity and bring glory to God. So if you work and you have to pay taxes, what we want are our tax organizations to tax us, but not unjustly. Don't be overbearing in taxing us. Right now, we are at about 63% to 65% in our taxation between federal tax and governmental tax and then sales tax. We only got about 35 cents on the dollar that we are working with. And inflation is making that even more difficult. You do understand that. It's a real challenge. Godly tax collectors, or let's see if we can even imagine a saved, redeemed, regenerated IRS system. The saved, redeemed, regenerated, God-glorifying tax structure in America. If that was right, a lot more people would be able to live off a whole lot more than we do presently, because our government is so draconian, so heavy, so top heavy with its own issues that it has to tax us. Here's the verse that I really want us to get at. This is verse 15 when it comes to the law enforcement issue. Here it is, verse 14 rather. And the soldiers likewise demanded of him, saying, and what shall we do? And he said unto them, do violence to no man. Do you guys see that? Point number one. Perfect, right? So the gospel speaks to the violence of law enforcement, doesn't it? So whenever you are dealing with people along the lines of these topics, you can show them that the Bible clearly and explicitly affirms that law enforcement must be just in every aspect of their engagement in society. And for us as believers, that is an a priori assumption. I assume that every believer understands that we don't want to advocate or affirm any kind of judicial system or law enforcement that does violence. So automatically, the preacher is saying, don't do violence to anyone. There you go. That shuts that down. If you are a true believer in Christ and you are a law enforcement agent, if you are a police officer, if you are a highway patrolman, if you are a National Guardsman, if you are a military person, what we are encouraging you to do is represent Christ in your calling, as is the case with part of our leadership at Grace, which is in military, has done military, as is the case with my son-in-law, as is the case with my daughter, and many people in my family who have been believers and are believers in the military. We need them. And here's two things we don't want to do. We don't want to defund the police department, and we don't want to defund the military. My daughter right now is dealing with the COVID thing. She's a medic, so she actually deals with the soldiers. She's in training to jump out of helicopters and rescue soldiers who, get into traumatic cases. This is what she's doing right now. And right now she's working at the veterans service in Palo Alto, and she's dealing with COVID cases. So she's putting herself in harm's way right now as a medic for our nation. And they don't pay military people that much. There are a lot of good benefits that they have in many different ways, and they deserve it. The last thing you and I want to do as an outrage over a political issue is strip down everything. That would be like our body being sick, your body and my body being sick with maybe a thorn in our finger, and that thorn creates a swelling because we get an infection there, and then we cut our whole arm off because of that infection. It's such overreach that it makes no sense. It's actually overkill. You do understand what I'm saying. And so it's important for us not to be emotionally trapped by the issues that are going on, no matter how painful a particular problem at the center of our thought, discourse, and debate is. It's important that we don't use solutions that actually countermand any kind of healthy outcome. We don't want to be emotional. We don't want to be irrational. We don't want to be illogical. And we never want to join the majority in creating unintended or intended consequences that actually is going to affect people more in the long run. Very important. And the soldiers likewise demanded him, saying, "What shall we do?" And he said unto them, do violence to no man, neither accuse any falsely. There you go again. Don't misrepresent the court system. And finally, be content with your what? Wages. We're not going to take your wages away. You need your wages. Thank you. I do have one. We're not going to take your wages away. We're not going to make you do, because you're not making enough money, have to work a second job when you get off, which is what law enforcement often have to do. We're not going to actually turn you into criminals, because you and I know by nature, according to Proverbs, if we don't have enough, we might steal. In fact, we are going to steal. And I love Solomon, because Solomon said, if a man steals because he's hungry, let him go. Right? So Solomon had a better ethic around why often people take things. If he's hungry, let him go, because somewhere there was inequity in his system and he was out of desperation inclined to go eat. It's just food. Don't shoot him. In Saudi Arabia, if you're caught stealing an apple, guess what they do? They cut your hand off. That's way over the top. That is not a balanced, just perspective on a crime like that. This is why when the Bible says a tooth for a tooth, an eye for an eye, a life for a life, that's called justice. Right. If you take a man's apple, then we're going to take your apple from you and give it back to him. But we're not going to take your life because you took an apple. Right. And so these are the kind of judgments we have to make when it comes to civil discourse, civil engagement, and things of that nature. All right. We got about 30 minutes before we enter into prayer mode. Young ladies, let me see. I've seen you before, haven't I? Yeah. You've been here before. Right. What's your name? Okay, Tiff. Give me a context. Tiffany what? What's your last name? Jefferson. Yeah, I knew. Generally, I'm looking at the tribe when they come. Oh, yeah. Tiff, how old are you now? Okay, well, what are you doing? Are you working? Are you getting about your business? What you up to? Okay, and did you know there was a Bible study tonight or prayer or what you coming there for?
Yeah, it was great.
Okay, cool. Tiff, and did y'all come together? No. Okay, what's your name? Yes.
I'm Naomi.
Naomi? Yeah. Naomi what?
Oh, no,
Okay, Naomi, have I met you before?
sort of. I met you at the Wednesday night in Oakland a few years ago.
Oh, okay. I don't remember that, I'm sorry.
Oh, no worries.
Did you know we were having a Tuesday night Bible study and prayer? How did you know?
Well, I knew it was happening a few years ago, but then it recently started up. I think I know from, I asked Alex.
That Alex? No.
Yeah, that Alex.
Okay, you know them?
Yeah.
Okay, cool. There you go. So now I just wanted to make sure. All right, so we are actually in the book of Daniel. I want to cast one more vision on you. Do you have your outline in front of you? We're in the book of Daniel because we're actually talking about vision right now. And then the rest of the folks will come in for prayer time, and we will have a prayer time for half an hour. We're in Daniel. We're dealing with a third vision in the book of Daniel. Daniel's a young man. Well, actually, at this point, he's a lot older. And we're dealing with a third vision out of 4. And we're in Daniel chapter 8. And I kind of want to just walk through this with us. And we're sorry if this is out of context with you. But Daniel has been given the privilege of seeing the world in visions all the way up to the end of time. And we thought about how remarkable that would be, that you and I would be able to have somewhat of a general, if not a specific vision that allows us to see God's workings and God's purposes all the way to the end of time. And should that be the case, what kind of response do I yield to the privilege of being able to see the big picture of events that are going on down the line? And so for Daniel, what a believer has been for Daniel for many, many years is a model of a man or a person or a believer who actually lives in a situation that is quite contrary to what his original calling and purpose was. As we stated before, Daniel is basically a captive in the Babylonian and now to be Medo-Persian kingdom, when as a Jew, he should be at home in his own country, back in Jerusalem, back in Palestine, but he recognizes that at the present things are not as they ought to be. And what the believer has to learn in our world is the same thing, that at present things are not as they ought to be. How do we survive in a world where we are destined to be in one place, but presently we are in another place? And in this other place, God has told us that we need to occupy and we need to be productive and we need to be able to thrive. That's what Daniel does for us. That's what his 3 companions does for us over in chapter 3. Daniel does for us what Matthew 16:33 said. John 16:33 says that in the world you're going to have what? Trouble. He says in the world you're going to have trouble. That's what our master says. These things I've spoken unto you that you might have peace. In the world you're going to have trouble. Daniel saw that trouble as a little boy. Daniel was deported with his family at about 8, 9, 10, 11 years old. By the time Daniel's 16 years old, him and his partners are in the middle of the eclectic group of astrologers, astronomers, mathematicians, prognosticators, mystics, and all trying to interpret Nebuchadnezzar's dream. Daniel discovered that he had the gift of vision, the gift of dreams, the gift of interpretations, rather, but he knew that God was sovereign and that God would actually have to help him understand Neb's dream. That catapulted Daniel and his 3 friends into political power. So the life of Daniel is the life of a believer working in the world of politics for the pagan. How oxymoronic is that? You are a believer. You are working in a pagan system whose philosophy largely is contrary to the gospel, but you are a major constituent of the prosperity and direction of that government. That's exactly what Christ has called us to in the world as well. You and I are called to be salt and light in the world. He sprinkles us in a world where the world is contrary to him, where the world does not operate out of a biblical model. And then sometimes it gets so bad that we are being confronted by the world at the level of threat of our life. This is where Daniel 3 becomes massive. Where the image, which is that what we already know is that one world global governmental paradigm where the whole world will bow down before the beast and submit to a kind of unified system. This is inherent in our addressing the communist socialist model that's trying to enforce itself upon us now. And everybody is ready to bow down to the system because, didn't we say this earlier? It's easy to agree. It's easy to agree. Everybody's ready to bow down. But Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, those three brothers, found that they couldn't abstain. You know why? Because as I stated to you earlier, they weren't old, they weren't tired, and they weren't ignorant. They were neither old nor tired or ignorant. They only had one other category to operate out of: argue. The category that Mishael, Hananiah, and Azariah were called to was to apologetically argue for the sovereignty of one true and living God over against any and every system that the people of God are confronted with. And so when you read Daniel 3 very carefully, the three brothers simply say to Nebuchadnezzar, you may have the power to do what you want, but what you don't have the power to do is change our identity. You don't have the power to change my worldview. You don't have the power to even cause me to be afraid. I remember distinctly what they said. We are not anxious. That's amazing, because that's what Christ is saying. In the world, you're going to have tribulation, but be of good cheer. I've overcome the world. In me is your peace. And this is what we're saying to people of God right now with everything that's going on. Do not be getting caught up in any kind of anxiety or fear or doubt. And certainly don't let the things that are happening to you in your world take you out of your identity. So those three boys, they were men by this time, faced the consequences of opposing that Antichrist system. And you guys know what happened, right? They were thrown into the what? Fiery furnace. And this is where in the New Testament the terminology of trials come in, right? The fiery trials which are to try you, right? Your faith being more pure than gold as that which is being tried in a furnace. So the believer is going to have trials at times that are going to be so severe. But in those trials, God will manifest his faithfulness in your life. This is kind of where we are. Now, we don't ever see those three men again, because the topic of the book of Daniel is about Daniel. So Daniel now is dealing with the second of four final visions. And tonight he's going to be dealing with what is called, in our outline, the first abomination that maketh desolate, the third beast in the kingdom. So I'm just going to read Daniel chapter 8, verses 1 through 8, and then we're going to kind of walk through our outline. If you know anything about the book of Daniel, this will bless you. If not, it'll kind of go over your head. And, that's a little bit difficult to do anything about. I'll see what I can to bring clarity to it. But notice what it says in Daniel chapter 8, verse 1. In the third year of the reign of the king Belshazzar, a vision appeared unto me, even unto me, Daniel, after that which appeared unto me at the first, talking about chapter 7. And I saw in a vision, and it came to pass when I saw that I was at Shushan in the palace, which is in the province of Elam. And I saw in a vision, and I was by the river Ulai, or Ulai, depending on how we want to translate that. Then I lifted up my eyes, and I saw, and beheld, there stood before the river a ram, which had two horns. And the two horns were high, but one was higher than the other, and the higher came up last. I saw the ram pushing westward and northward and southward, so that no beast might stand before him. Neither was there any that could deliver out of his hand. But he did according to his will, and he became great. And as I was considering, behold, an he-goat came from the west on the face of the whole earth, and touched not the ground. And the goat had a notable horn between his eyes. He came to the ram that had two horns, which I had seen standing before the river, and ran unto him in the fury of his power. And I saw him come close unto the ram, and he was moved with choler against him, and smote the ram, and brake his two horns, and there was no power in the ram to stand before him. But he cast him down to the ground and stomped upon him, and there was none that could deliver him out of his hands. Therefore the he-goat waxed very great. Now when he was strong, the great horn was broken, and for it came up four notable ones toward the four winds of heaven. One last statement, and then we'll leave verses 9 through the rest of the chapter to our next study, called the little horn. And out of one of them came forth a little horn, which waxed exceedingly great toward the south, toward the east, toward the pleasant land. Thus is the reading of God's word. I mean, really, the narrative is beautiful. I already told you we're dealing with imagery, we're dealing with visions, and we're dealing with what? Zoomorphisms. You have to know that. We're dealing with animal-like characteristics operating in a kind of animal kingdom with animal kingdom dynamics. So here's how we will do this. We will work through the first point in our outline. And if anyone understands chapter 7 in relationship to chapter 8, in chapter 7, we saw four beasts. In chapter 7, verses 1 through 5, a lion, a bear, a leopard, and then a strange monstrosity that becomes the fourth kingdom. We're already aware that we're dealing with kingdoms, right? The first kingdom, represented by a lion, is the kingdom of what? Babylon. The second kingdom, represented by a bear, is the kingdom of what? Medo-Persia. The third kingdom, represented by a leopard, is what? Is Greece. And then the fourth kingdom, diverse from all the others, that cannot be described any kind of zoomorphic way, is what kingdom? The Roman Empire. What you and I are dealing with is history from the time of Babylon all the way through the Roman Empire era. Some saying ending at AD 70, others saying ending in around either 400 BC or 700 BC. We can talk about that when we get back to the book of the Revelation. It's important to know that these kingdoms are clearly identified and laid out in the scriptures, with the exception in the book of Daniel of the Roman Empire. The Roman Empire is not explicitly made mention of, but it's impossible to interpret it any other way because history has already affirmed that that fourth kingdom is the Roman Empire. So look at point number 1 in your outline. Point number 1 in your outline. Basically at the top, I say that Daniel has a vision which has occurred. He had a vision in what year? 553 BC. So Daniel is in 553 BC. Daniel's family, the Judite tribe, goes into captivity in 587 BC. I know this is going to mess with your head. We only got about 20 minutes, but what's the differentiation between 587 BC and 533 BC? How many years is that? How much? 54? All right, so you better watch that. I know you went to government school. A little bit more than 50 years. A little bit more than 50 years. A little bit more than 50 years. Daniel was 16 years old when he goes into Babylon. Between 16 and 25, him and his partners get a job in the Senate because of the gift that they have. Now he's 50 years, almost 50 years later, he's about 70 years old, 75 years old. Very seasoned, mature man in this second vision. And what's interesting about the vision that's at hand that Daniel is dealing with that we're going to unpack is this is what we would call a forward-oriented vision. Now, often the prophets would have visions, but often those visions would be historical in their premise and then future in their outcome. Prophetic visions are not always forward-oriented. You can have a vision that actually takes you to the past, to the past, and show you what things that occurred. In this context, when we look at verse 1, Daniel gives us a timeline. Again, that becomes important. Notice what it says. In the 3rd year of the reign of the king Belshazzar, a vision appeared unto me, as unto me Daniel, that after that which appeared unto me at the first. For those of us who are theologians, we understand that what's going on here is that presently Daniel is under the governance of Nebuchadnezzar's son. This would take you back to chapter 5, where we already learned last week, Nebuchadnezzar's son, that crazy fool, had a great feast, and he took the artifacts of the temple and used them to party with. But if you were to go back there, you would see that at that time, the Babylonians are still ruling. Daniel is under that rule. Here we have in the 3rd year of Belshazzar, we have over in chapter 7, in the 1st year of Belshazzar, king of Babylon, Daniel had the dream. So Belshazzar is ruling when Daniel gets the first dream of the 4 beasts. He's ruling yet in the 3rd. Here, this is his 3rd year Belshazzar's ruling. Nebuchadnezzar is probably alive, but there was a co-regency taking place. He would die here shortly after, but we know that Belshazzar's end is about to come. This is also what I said to you before, that if you're reading Daniel chapter 8, but in Daniel chapter 5, we see the demise of Belshazzar, then you know the book is not strictly what? Chronological. So the prophecy we're reading in chapter 8 does not mean that we are along those same lines historically, or the historical narrative we read in chapter 5 does not mean we're locked into that chronology. It's just that in the order in which Daniel is receiving these visions and they lay it out in his codification, we are now just seeing how that when Daniel was under the reign of Belshazzar, he had this vision. And what's interesting about this, saints, is this. While Daniel is serving the Babylonians, God is showing him how he's going to be part of the Medo-Persian Empire. Look at this next verse before we unpack it. Watch this. And I saw in a vision, and it came to pass when I saw that I was at Shushan the palace. Do you see that? Right. So if you will, pull up the map for me of the Babylonian kingdom. I want you guys to get a little visual out of this. This is quite fascinating when it comes to vision. Because vision for me is absolutely critical to the leading of the people of God. You got to know how God works to help you comprehend vision. So this is the Babylonian rule. Remember, we saw that the parameters of his rule are on the inside of the Medo-Persia region. The Medo-Persia is in the yellow. In other words, the Babylonians do not have any kind of impact or control or influence over the Medo-Persians. Their reign never did push into Medo-Persia. In Daniel chapter 2, Daniel chapter 3, Daniel chapter 4, Daniel is operating within the Babylonian era. See that star where it says Babylon? That's where Daniel is right now, having the vision. He's having the vision in Babylon, but as he's having the vision, where does he see himself? Over in Medo-Persia, in Elam. So pull up the map of Medo-Persia. Let me show you something. You guys already saw how that we were able to affirm that the Babylonians had a portion of land, but once we got to the Medo-Persians, their land got larger. And once we got to the Grecian kingdom, it got larger. And once you get to the Roman kingdom, it gets large. So here we are now in the Medo-Persian reign. Do you see where it says Susa? There it is, Susa. Now, Susa is in between Media and Persia. That word Susa, you will find Shushan, you will find that in the book of Nehemiah chapter 1, don't go there, and in the book of Esther, because Nehemiah, Esther, and Ezra are living in the time when the Persian kingdom is ruling. Cyrus, Darius, Xerxes I, Artaxerxes, Xerxes II, they're living in that period of time. You guys got that? What's fascinating to me is that Daniel is in the area of Babylon. This one here doesn't give you a clear distinction between the two, but he sees himself in the area of Medo-Persia. And I wish there was a more accurate map. But while you're here, look way up north for a moment. I want to show you something. Do you see where it says Greece? Way north? You see Greece? Go up further north. Do you see Thrace? And then go further down. Do you see Egypt? Daniel's about to tell us about those three here in his vision. So now go back to our text and follow me in your outline and think about this. Here you are serving in Babylon, and you're getting a vision about serving in Medo-Persia. What is that telling you about Babylon in terms of its implication? God is telling you that Babylon is going down, but you're going to be all right. because God's going to transition you through the change of that kingdom into the next kingdom. This is quite fascinating, but this is also what I meant by vision. The purpose of vision is to give guidance and to give insight to the people of God. When God's people are operating out of a clarity of vision, it brings comfort. Daniel is being told that his position as a mediator for his people and a help for the pagan governments that he's under is not threatened. I love that, because if we were to work that through a little bit sociologically, when we get older, we get a whole lot less secure. Daniel's about 70 years old. He's been serving in Babylon since he was 20 years old. He'd done 50, 60 years. In our day, you'd be ready to retire. I had already been retired. But Daniel's a great statesman. He understands the world. He understands God's promises to his own people. His own people are already about to go back. In fact, the vision that Daniel is seeing of him being in Elam is in preparation for his people to go back in that next vision that we're having in Daniel chapter 9. So you and I have to understand that when God gives us vision, he gives us vision to understand our position. He gives us vision to understand our future, and he gives it to us to help us impact other people in their lives for comfort and for clarity. This is remarkable. So going back to your outline, let's just deal with the first point. We've got a few more minutes. The first point, I kind of want to unpack this. Now, I open up under point number 1 saying the bear becomes a what? A ram. Write it down. The bear becomes a ram. How do we know? Because in chapter 7, he's a bear. In chapter 8, he's a ram. And we dealt with, and I can't go back for time's sake to talk about the attributes and characteristics of the bear. But the bear, as we learned last week through all the verses that were employed in it, was a rapacious, violent, clumsy, overbearing creature who didn't operate out of finesse or operate out of any kind of tactfulness. He would circle miles around. And that's how he was indicated in the text, that he was lying down, chewing up on some ribs, remember? And then he rose up on his side, and he looked and he saw, and a command was given to him to what? Rise up and devour. In other words, the Medo-Persian kingdom now is about to rise up and take over Babylon. And we learned that explicitly in the book of Isaiah. So now that Babylon has been perceived as coming to its demise in chapter 7, Daniel now receives another vision of Medo-Persia in chapter 8. And it's only a couple years between these two visions. So in the first set of visions, I know he didn't go back and tell Belshazzar, hey, Belly, you know, man, I had a vision, brother. You gone. I'm just letting you know now. You need to pack your bags and roll. He couldn't tell him that. All right. And then he has a vision a couple years later, and that vision now is putting him on a river. And the river motif is absolutely critical too. Because remember, John said in John's gospel, in the book of the Revelation chapter 13, and I saw beasts coming up out of the sea. This is Revelation 13:1. This here is your Ezekiel Danielic motif of the prophet being at the river. And the river becomes now a kind of analogy of horizons that make a distinction between one national group and another. In this context, it would have been the Euphrates River, making a distinction between the Babylonians and the Medo-Persians. It was also that Euphrates River that we talked about in Daniel 8 and 9. Let me see here. Yeah, and I stood upon the sand of the sea, and I saw beasts rise up out of the sea. This is John having the same kind of edge of the horizon on the waters. Now, remember what we learned that the seas were? They represented the masses of the people. They represent the humanity, clearly interpreted that way. So go back to Daniel chapter 8. I want to just press into our first point, and we'll pick this up more fully tomorrow and unpack this a little bit more. Daniel in his vision is at the river, seeing himself over in Elam. Elam is one of the major cities of Medo-Persia, and obviously God is saying you're going to be all right. I saw that I was at Shushan in the palace, which is in the province of Elam. And I saw in a vision, and I was by the river of Ula, a small river connected to the Euphrates River that went down to the Tigris River. And this here would let Daniel know that he's getting ready to deal with not only the demise of the Babylonian kingdom, but the entrance and emergence of the Medo-Persian kingdom. And then he says in verse 3 these words. Then I lifted up my eyes and I saw, and behold, before the river, what? A ram. So this ram is at the river. This ram is on the horizon of existence, which had two horns. Now this would correspond going back to Daniel chapter 7, verse 5. If you look at Daniel chapter 7, verse 5, notice what it says. And behold, another beast, a second like a bear, raised up on one of its sides, and it had three ribs in its mouth, in between its teeth, and they said thus unto it, arise and devour much. This is the correspondence between those two. This bear becomes this ram, and it raised up itself on what? One side. It had two sides, but it raised up on one side. Now watch how that language becomes parallel with the character of the ram back in Daniel chapter 8. Look at what it says over in Daniel 8. Again, at verse 3, then I lifted up my eyes and I saw and behold, there stood before the river a ram which had two horns. Now watch this. And the two horns were high. They were high, but one was higher than the other. The bear that lifted up on one side represented the horn of dominant power, much more dominant power than the horn that was smaller. You guys see the parallels? In this context, this is Persia. Media is the smaller horn that initially took Babylon under Darius. But Persia is the higher horn of Xerxes, Artaxerxes, as they went on to dominate the whole world. Does that make some sense? That is your kind of like snippet of news that we need to know. And Daniel sees this as a vision of a ram. So you know rams are very powerful. Your mountain rams, they can get at it, and they love button heads. So you got a ram on the horizon. He's already exercised power. He's already overcome the Babylonians. And then notice what it says in verse 4. And I saw the ram doing what? Pushing westward and northward and southward. We already saw what that was. We saw how that the Medo-Persians took the area going up towards Asia, going up towards Asia Minor, then going over into the Middle East, taking out Babylon, and then taking out Israel. So they up in if we were to go back to the map, I'm compelled to do it, but I don't have time to do it. The three sides again has to do with them prevailing over everything short of Greece up there in Asia, prevailing over the Babylonians, and then also prevailing over towards national Israel. So pushing toward the west, the northward and southward, so that no beast might stand before him, neither was there any that could deliver him out of his hand, but he did according to his will, and he became great. That is the Medo-Persian kingdom. Again, if you were to look at the map, it would show you that they became prominent. And it's interesting because the Medo-Persian kingdom survived from 539 BC to 330 BC. All right, let's do some numbers right quick because we only got a few more things to do here. Let's just say 530 BC to 330 BC. How many years? 200. That's a long time for the existence of a kingdom, given what was going on. 200 years would the Medo-Persian kingdom be in domination. So that's what you get in verse 4. 200 years would they be great, and they would be doing whatever they want to. This is the same Medo-Persian kingdom that Jessica, did you watch 300? You did? How many of y'all watched 300? Have you watched 300, young lady? Yeah. Okay, what's your name again? Naomi. I won't ever forget. Naomi, have you ever watched 300? Do you watch TV? Okay. If you're going to continue in our class, here's your homework assignment. You have to watch 300. Have you watched 300, young lady? You got to watch 300. You too. Okay? If you're coming back to class, as we're dealing with history, you watch 300? 300? Who here hasn't watched 300? Good, y'all. Deb, come on, Deb. You ain't watched no 300. Help your mama, because this is about theology, okay? Help your mama. Now you understand, Jessica, what we were talking about the nature of the diversity and its relevance of the Persian kingdom to today. You saw Xerxes. You saw our trans black centric king, right? You saw him. Right. This is why there's nothing new under the sun. You want to watch it. The notion of progressivism is really an oxymoronic concept. We are really digressing and we are really regressing. And you really want to know that. The movie will help you kind of get a larger visual. A few more minutes. Let me see what we're doing here. So in this context, what we are seeing is that they're great because they're doing what they want for 200 years. They're limited. Pull that map back up again. I want to get this vision. They're limited, but I mean, they're an empire. They're going to be that way for a while. And here it is. They have power over Egypt. They got power over Judah. They got power over this area here, Parthia, Aria, Bactria, Arachosia, Carminia, Gedrosia. This here is pushing over down, all the way down towards the borders of India. They have a lot of influence. Armenia, Lydia, Thrace, they're all the way up, bumping up against the Grecian kingdom. But you notice they don't have Greece. Greece is coming next. Greece is our next beast that we're about to deal with in verse number 5. Okay, I want you guys to see that. So as much as the Persian Empire is much bigger than the Babylonian Empire, you know who they're not messing with? The Grecians. Now they tried. They tried to get at the Grecians. All right. And they're a ram, but the Grecians were goats. I love zoomorphisms. Because do you know anything about goats? This is one thing you can know about goats. They're literal, but they're honorary. Goats are little and they're honorary. They have like way too much testosterone, okay? Like way over the top. They don't even care about size. And that's what you're getting ready to deal with here. Look at verse 5 in our text. And as I was considering, behold, an he-goat came from the west. That's where that would have been. Greece is in the west. And he-goat comes from the west. It was the far west in our map. And he-goat came from the west on the face of the whole earth, and he touched not the ground. What does that mean? He was flying. He was flying. He touched not the ground, and the goat had a notable horn between his eye. He only had one horn, but that horn was called what? Notable. Literally means huge, massive. Now the picture he's painting is of a goat that is so powerful, so dominant, so aggressive, so driven by his own ambition and power and greatness in himself, that he's going to become a problem for the ram. And the ram is much bigger than him. The ram is much bigger than him. But he wants to go at the ram. So notice what it says in verse 6. Watch how this goes. And he came to the ram that had the two horns. Now he ain't got but one. The two horns are Media and Persia. He came at the ram that had two horns, which I had seen standing before the river. And what did he do? He ran unto him in the fury of his power. I wish I would have saw that on History Channel. I wish I would have saw that on National Geographic. I just love that stuff. I could sit up till 3 o'clock in the morning watching it. I just wish I could have saw it. I don't need nothing. No coffee or nothing. And he ran unto him in the fury of his power. What's going on with this he-goat and his drive to go after this beast that's much bigger than him and potentially capable of actually dominating him? Because see, if you actually know the history behind the massive military might of the Medo-Persian kingdom and the small, relatively minuscule army of the Grecian kingdom, numerically it makes no sense. Numerically, it makes no sense for this he-goat to go at this ram with the kind of fury he's going after him at, except he's mad at the ram. And he really does not care about size. See, it's not the size of the dog in the fight. It's the size of the fight in the dog. This particular he-goat is driven to go to war against the ram, because the ram, exercising his two horns, has dogged everybody all around the region for the last 200 years. The Persian kingdom was a very aggressive, very dominating, very arrogant, very pompous kingdom. The Persian kingdom took on the motif of being God itself. It would use the term, I am God. I am the great God. Besides me, there is no other. Again, you saw how in 300 where Xerxes was talking as if he was a god. Remember? I am merciful. I am gracious. I will give you riches. Bow down before me. And it was evident in his acting that what he wanted people to do was to worship him, right? This is where we're going in our culture with statism, quite frankly. So Xerxes became a kind of perverted tempter, but at the same time, aggressive oppressor. That's the characteristic of his role. And people intimidated by him would bow down. Well, Sparta didn't bow down. And Sparta is buttressed right up over against what? Greece. Right? Because it was part of the Grecian dominion. And this horn coming out of Greece is none other than who? Alexander the Great. Alexander the Great. And Alexander the Great is raised up under precarious circumstances, but he has always proven himself to be, from a little boy, to be an excellent warrior, to be an excellent rider of horses, and he became a massive general. And his campaign only lasted 12 years. From 336 BC to 323 BC. In 12 years, the Grecian kingdom came in and took over all that region. Show us the map of the Grecian kingdom, if you don't mind. I want to just show you what he did in 12 years. We don't have time to unpack it. I'm just giving you kind of a look at where he is. We're way up in Macedonia. You see Macedonia? That is Greece. Athens, Pella. Pella is where Alexander the Great was born. Thrace, you see that? Asia Minor, Armenia. You see he's way over in Medo-Persia. He's way over. He's pushing the boundaries of Egypt. Of India, isn't he? Way down here in the southeast. And then look at, he breaks all the way into Egypt. He's pushing into Africa, isn't he? Alexander the Great was absolutely remarkable. He was demonically possessed. And his military campaigns were fierce. And it was irrational how powerful he became, because it could not be summed up by numbers. And so for us, what we know is this, that God raises up kings and God sets down kings. Please understand this. When God chooses to have someone rule, whether a monarchy or a kingdom or a dynasty, you and I can put into the equation every human logical calculus we can find to try to justify why that individual is prevailing, and it will all fail. Because we're failing to understand that God is acting sovereignly to choose whom he will. Nobody particularly cared for Alexander the Great. But Alexander the Great didn't particularly care about nobody. So it was mutual. God gave Alexander the Great the power to take over the known world at that time and Hellenize it. Basically, he brought that whole region that we're looking at into a kind of unified Greek cultural synthesis, where everybody learned the Greek language, this is where your Alexandrian library in Egypt was built, one of the most famous libraries in the world. It was Alexander the Great. His campaigns were designed to bring about a mass unity around the world in order that the Greek language would be the common language from Egypt all the way up to where he was in Pella, for one reason. Do you know what that is? The gospel. The gospel. God raised Alexander the Great up and gave the whole world that were divided into their own tribes with their own dialects and their own genre, one common language, because Jesus Christ was coming into the world and the New Testament would be written in Greek and thus spread to all these regions around the world. So a lot of times we're looking at political issues and failing to understand the purpose of God behind it. And this is critical for us as people of God, never to collapse into mere human political calculations or preferences or assumptions on our part as to what should be done. I mean, I'm gonna bump you a little bit and mess your head up again as we close and get ready for prayer. It does not matter one whit for true believers who understand the sovereignty of God. It should never, ever be an argument. There should never be a debate. There should never be a conflict between true believers who really understand that God turns the hearts of the kings, that he controls every one of them. He sets up who he wants to, and he brings down who he wants to. Nebuchadnezzar taught us that, didn't he? The heavens do rule in the kingdoms of men. Believers should never, ever wring their hands about who occupies the White House. Never, ever once should a believer ever worry about who's in the White House. As long as we know that Christ is on the throne, guess what Daniel did? He served under crazy Neb. His son was just a straight psychopath, Neb's son, and Daniel served under him. Darius was a loving king, but he was a wimp. I mean, he was such a wimp, he had his boy ending up in a lion's den because a bunch of his own subordinates hoodwinked him. And Daniel survived all three of them. And never once said, Lord, I don't like this man ruling over me. And he was able to operate out of vision and realize that God was in control and that God had set that up. And this is where we have to learn how to be too. Because otherwise we get distracted from our mission.